A billionaire CEO unexpectedly runs into his ex-girlfriend outside a supermarket. Standing beside her are three 6-year-old boys who look strikingly like him. The perfect life he spent 6 years building shatters in an instant. But this is only the beginning of a journey that will change everything. One July afternoon, the city of Boston was steeped in sweltering heat and the endless blare of car horns. People waited irritably at traffic lights, drivers muttering behind their steering wheels. Yet, amid all the haste and frustration, a man stepped out of a sleek black Bentley, adjusting his tie as if the chaos of the world around him was of no concern. Michael Bennett, 38 years old, CEO of Bennett Innovations, had just returned to the U.S. after 6 years of building a tech empire in Asia. His face no longer carried the youth it once did, but his eyes remained sharp and proud. He was walking to his penthouse, partly to avoid the traffic jam, partly to reconnect with the pulse of the city that had once been his home. He turned into a narrow street, perhaps by chance, and then fate suddenly called his name. In front of a modest supermarket, a woman was struggling to carry bags while keeping track of 3 lively little boys, as bright and restless as small rays of sunshine. "Ryan, don't run too far. Ethan, give the toy back to your brother. Caleb, stand still, please." That voice, though years had passed, hit Michael like a jolt of electricity, stopping him in his tracks. His throat tightened. His heart, accustomed to beating only for billion-dollar deals, now raced uncontrollably at the sound of a name he thought he'd buried in the past. Emily Parker. He stared. She had changed, looking tired, thinner, but it was still her eyes, her voice, the essence of an entire youth he once knew. What froze Michael in place, however, was the sight of those 3 boys. 6 years old, brown hair and green eyes, the same green eyes as his own. The world seemed to collapse and rebuild itself in an instant. All logic, plans, and calculations shattered before a truth both terrifying and beautiful. "They're mine, my 3 children, Emily." Michael's voice broke, weak as the trembling in his chest. She turned, their eyes met. 1 second, then a storm of memories flooded back. Emily froze, clutching her children closer, but she didn't run. She only whispered, "Tomorrow, noon, Brewster's Cafe." Then she left. And Michael stood there, alone amid the bustling street, dazed, as a light rain began to fall. He had just glimpsed his entire life. 3 children he never knew he had, and the woman he'd once abandoned without. So, the small house nestled quietly in a peaceful neighborhood, not far from downtown Boston, yet entirely detached from the luxurious world Michael Bennett knew so well. He stood before the faded blue door, holding 3 identical gift bags, each containing a model airplane, the only thing he was certain the boys would like, based on Emily's brief note. He pressed the doorbell. The chime rang out like a command to himself, to begin the encounter he'd never imagined in his lifetime. When the door opened, Emily stood there, her face strangely calm. She stepped aside. "Come in, they're in the living room." No reproach, no softened gaze, just a mother putting her children before her own emotions. Michael stepped inside. The faint scent of vanilla cookies wafted through the air, starkly contrasting the thick tension building in his chest. 3 boys sat on the sofa, Ryan in a red t-shirt, Ethan in blue, and Caleb in olive green. They turned to look at him, almost in unison. He froze. 3 pairs of green eyes stared back, unfamiliar, probing, like his own when facing an uncertain business deal. But this time he had no strategy, no plan. "Kids." His voice came out hoarse, catching in his throat. Ryan stood up first, extending a hand. "I'm Ryan, the oldest, 4 minutes ahead of those 2. Ethan approached a beat later. "I'm Ethan. Are you really our dad?" Caleb didn't budge. He crossed his arms, his eyes coldly fixed on Michael. "You probably didn't want to meet us, otherwise you'd have come sooner." Emily started to speak, but Michael gently raised a hand to stop her. He knelt down, bringing his eyes level with theirs. Your dad messed up. Didn't know you existed. But that's not an excuse. If I had known, I would have come. I'd never have left." Silence, heavy. Ethan looked down, Ryan stole a glance at his mom, and Caleb remained silent, still as a locked fortress. Michael held out the 3 gift bags. "I brought you something small, nothing big. Model airplanes, if you like them." Ryan opened his bag first. "I like airplanes," he said, his voice light as a breeze. Ethan touched the model in his bag, his lips twitching upward but not quite forming a smile. Caleb didn't move. "I don't need a gift," the youngest said, his tone steady. "I just want to know if you're going to walk away again." The room was full of people, yet all Michael could hear was Emily's faint sigh. He looked into Caleb's eyes, and for the first time he understood what it meant to pay the price for his absence. "No, son, I'm staying, if you'll let me." Caleb didn't reply. But the sharpness in his gaze softened slightly, and for Michael, that fragile shift was the most precious glimmer of hope he'd ever held on to. The Saturday afternoon sky was unusually clear and blue. Franklin Park basked in sunlight, its neatly trimmed patches of grass seeming to await something special. On the field, children in tiny uniforms ran around with uncontainable excitement. Michael arrived early, clutching a water bottle and a bag of cookies he'd made himself, something he once thought he'd never do, but now it set his heart racing. He sat in the front row of the wooden bleachers, his eyes fixed on the number 7. Ryan, the boy he'd met just a week ago. Ryan was warming up, his face glowing among his teammates. He didn't yet know Michael was there. And Michael wasn't sure if he should wave or simply wait in silence. A hand lightly touched his shoulder. Emily. She sat beside him, giving a slight nod, not smiling but not cold either. "He said today his dad would come," she whispered. "I didn't dare promise him anything." Michael looked, down at his feet. "I didn't dare promise either. But I'm here." On the field, Ryan turned, his gaze sweeping the bleachers. Those eyes found Michael, and in an instant, the boy's small face lit up. "Dad!" Ryan shouted, waving frantically, drawing the attention of his entire team. Michael shot to his feet, waving back, swallowing the lump in his throat. He'd never seen a look like that before, not the look of a business partner signing a $100 million deal, but the look of a child realizing the person they'd hoped for had actually shown up. The game began. Michael sat still, hands clenched, eyes glued to Ryan as if he might cry if he looked away for even a second. When Ryan caught the first ball at second base, the crowd clapped, but only one person leapt up and shouted, "Great job, Ryan!" Ryan turned back, his smile so wide it seemed to touch the sky. After the game, Ryan ran to Michael before even reaching his mom. "Did you see me play?" Michael dropped to one knee, opening his arms as Ryan barreled into a hug. "I saw you. You were amazing. I'm proud of you." Ryan didn't say anything, just squeezed Michael's hand tighter. A 6-year-old child with a heart full of trust slowly being stitched back together, not by extravagant gifts, but by presence, by honest words. Ethan and Caleb stood behind, quiet. Caleb still kept his distance, but this time his gaze wasn't entirely closed off. It held a silent question. "Will you come next time?" Michael looked at all 3 children, then at Emily, his voice low but firm. "If you play 10 more games, I'll be there for all 10. And that day, under Boston's gentle sunlight, Michael didn't just watch a baseball game. For the first time, he touched the sacred essence of fatherhood, witnessing the moment his child smiled and called out those 2 words, "Dad." On a clear Sunday morning, sunlight spilled over Boston's streets like the radiant gaze of a father planning his first outing with his children. Michael stood at Emily's doorstep, wearing a rolled-up shirt, holding a coffee cup and a bag of cookies, a nervous smile breaking through his usual composure. "We're going to the Science Museum," he announced, as the 3 boys rushed out, each in a different colored shirt. Ryan buzzing with energy, Ethan clutching an astronomy book, and Caleb eyeing him warily. Still, Michael felt he was doing the right thing, beginning the journey to make amends. The SUV glided smoothly, filled with the hum of chatter. Ryan rambled on about robots, Ethan quietly flipped through his book, and Caleb occasionally glanced out the window. Michael's heart swelled. "I'm being a dad. I'm here." But then his phone buzzed, a message from Singapore. Urgent response needed on contract. He ignored it. The museum came into view, its silver domes gleaming in the morning light. The boys dashed into the lobby, eyes sparkling. Michael snapped photos, his joy almost childlike. But his phone buzzed again, an urgent email. "Just 2 minutes," he muttered, stepping into a hallway corner. The call stretched to 15. When he returned, Caleb sat with arms crossed, his face stone cold. Ethan looked at him with quiet disappointment. Ryan murmured, "You said it'd be quick." Michael crouched down, exhaling deeply. "I'm sorry, there was something urgent at work." "Work's always more important than us, isn't it?" Caleb's voice was flat, no tears, but the words sliced into Michael's chest like a thin, sharp blade. He froze, speechless. Any explanation now would just sound like an excuse. He'd already missed 6 years. Now, in just a few minutes, he'd hurt them again. Amid the spinning planetary models and the sound of children laughing around them, the four walked through the museum corridors in silence. Ryan's excitement had faded. Ethan hugged his book tighter. Caleb lagged behind. Lunch at the small cafe was just as quiet. When his phone rang again, Michael turned it off, but it was too late. The warmth had gone cold. Emily ushered the boys to the car. Michael wanted to say something, anything, to salvage the morning, but all he managed was a faint nod. "Let's go," Emily said, her tone free of blame, but her eyes carrying a sky full of disappointment. As the car door shut, Michael stood alone outside the museum. In his hand, he still held tickets for the space exhibit he'd planned as the day's finale. A light breeze brushed past, but his heart felt heavy. He realized being a father wasn't just about showing up. It was about truly being present, and sometimes a single phone call was enough to shatter the most fragile thing of all, the trust that had just begun to bloom. The phone buzzed in the middle of the meeting, a relentless vibration that pounded straight into Michael's chest. He glanced at the screen. "Emily, emergency call. Sorry," he said curtly to the room, rising from his chair as if pulled by an invisible thread. "Michael," Emily's voice cracked the moment he answered. "Mason's having trouble breathing. The school called. I'm taking him to the ER." His heart slammed against his ribs. No questions, no hesitation. He turned and bolted from the building. His assistant called after him, mentioning the $1 million negotiation in progress. Michael didn't respond. Only one thought filled his mind. Mason needs me. Boston Hospital loomed ahead, its stark white lights glaring. Michael rushed into the pediatric wing, eyes scanning frantically. Emily sat trembling in the waiting area, Ryan's arm around her shoulders. Caleb hunched over with his head down. "Where is he?" Michael demanded. "He's on a ventilator. The doctor says it's a severe asthma attack," she replied, her eyes red and swollen. "They're trying to stabilize his oxygen." Michael sank into a chair, hands clutching his head. Just this morning, Mason had been grinning ear to ear, and now, in just a few hours. If he'd stayed at the office today like usual. The room's door swung open. A nurse gestured. "One family member can come in." Michael shot to his feet, Emily's gaze flickering with uncertainty. She nodded. He stepped inside, his heart seizing as he saw Mason on the bed, pale, fragile, a breathing tube coiled around his tiny nose. "Mason," he whispered, grasping the boy's cold little hand. Mason's eyes fluttered open, weak and slow. "Dad!" His voice was a faint breath, but it was enough to choke Michael's chest. "I'm here, buddy. I'm not going anywhere." A tear slipped from Michael's eye, not from fear but from regret, for all the times he hadn't been there, For the phone calls he'd prioritized over his kids, he stayed by Mason's side all afternoon, never once stepping away. His phone rang. He powered it off. Contracts, negotiations, they could wait. His son's life couldn't. That night, as Mason stabilized and drifted to sleep, the doctor said, "Good thing he got here in time. He'll recover, but he needs close monitoring." Back in the waiting area, Michael met Emily's eyes. No blame lingered there, just exhaustion. He sat beside her, taking her hand. "I'm sorry," he said, more honest than he'd ever been. "I know I've messed up, but from today, nothing matters more than the kids." She looked at him for a long moment, silent, but the faint squeeze of her hand in return, like a quiet affirmation, was enough. Michael knew he couldn't change the past, but in that moment, amid the hospital's cold sterility and the steady hum of the ventilator, he made the real choice to be a father, not just with promises, but with actions, and this time he wouldn't break his word. The Friday afternoon seemed to slip by faster than usual. Michael glanced at his watch, 5:52 p.m. Traffic was gridlocked. One hand gripped the steering wheel, the other frantically dialed Emily. No answer. His heart pounded. Caleb's first piano recital he'd promised. 6:30 p.m. On time, no excuses. The car inched through clogged intersections. Sweat soaked his shirt collar. He pulled out his phone, rereading Emily's last text. "Caleb's really nervous. Don't be late. 6:17.622.631. Michael screeched to a halt outside the elementary school. He sprinted through the empty halls, breath ragged, shoes echoing coldly. When he reached the auditorium doors, the lights were off. People were leaving. He froze. Emily stepped out, holding Caleb's music bag and a folded program in her hands. Meeting his gaze, she said nothing, just gave him a look, not accusatory, but heavy with a silence more piercing than words. I'm sorry. Traffic, a call from the Singapore investors." His voice broke, meaningless in the chilly air. "He sat waiting for you the whole time," Emily replied, her tone low but sharp, cold and gut-wrenching. "He wouldn't go on stage until the very last second. Finally, the teacher had to cancel his performance because there wasn't enough time. He went straight home without a word." Michael didn't know where to put his hands, where to look. Everything inside him tightened. Again, it was him. Another broken promise. "I'll go to the house. I have to apologize to Caleb. Explain." "It's not about explanations," Emily cut in, her eyes glinting with the weariness of years spent alone. "Your son needs action. He doesn't need another night counting disappointments." Michael swallowed hard, silent. Then he nodded. This time, no excuses. He walked to the parking lot, sitting still behind the wheel. It felt like he'd lost something immeasurable. Not in money, but in the disappointed eyes of a child who'd trusted him one more time. In the quiet darkness, he opened his phone, not to check emails, to open his calendar. He deleted every weekend meeting, one by one. Enough. Tomorrow he'd be there early. No flowers, just himself. On time, true to his word, responsible. He typed a message to Emily. "I'm not asking for another chance. I'll make one, and I'll never let it slip away again." The pain was quiet but sharp, like a light in the night. This time he'd truly woken up, not just as a father, but as the man he still wanted to be. Not at the company, but at home. The conference room on the 39th floor was bathed in stark white light and a heavy silence. 13 board members sat around the long table, their eyes fixed on Michael. Behind him, a bold headline glowed on the screen. "Restructuring culture, family as the strongest foundation." "Thank you all for being here today," Michael began, his voice low, each word deliberate and resolute. "I know this proposal is unlike any strategic meeting we've had before. It's not about financial growth or market expansion. It's about people." No one spoke. A few eyebrows furrowed. The CFO sighed. Richard, the board chairman, crossed, his arms, his gaze skeptical. I want Bennett Group to be the first tech conglomerate in America to place family at the core of its operations, from flexible schedules and expanded leave policies to building a campus that integrates schools, playgrounds, and childcare support. And the cost? One member interjected, voice sharp. We're trading hundreds of millions for a sentimental ideal? Michael looked up, unflinching. No. We're investing in the one thing that keeps a person committed to their work for a lifetime, the connection to their family that work doesn't destroy. He paused, then softened his tone. His voice was no longer that of a CEO, but of a father speaking truth. 3 weeks ago, I reconnected with an ex-girlfriend, someone I left behind for work. She's raising 3 kids, my kids, who I didn't even know existed. For 6 years, I was completely absent from their lives. I made billions, but in return, I got the wary look in my son's eyes when I first walked into his home. Silence. A few shifted in their seats, their gazes wavering. I'm not here to tell a personal story, Michael continued, his voice gentler but no less resolute. I am here to change the way I and so many in this room have been swept up by a culture that sees being present for family as a weakness. A faint cough broke the quiet. The head of investments cleared their throat. Do you realize what you're risking, Michael? The Singapore project is on the brink of losing funding. ER is worried about shareholder backlash. We've never gone this route. I know, he replied softly. And I'm ready to pay the price. If it means using my personal wealth to build this campus, I'll do it. If it means stepping down as CEO to preserve the old way, I'll give up my seat. But what I can't do is miss another piano recital because of an urgent email. The room fell silent, not in resistance, but in the kind of quiet where thoughts begin to turn inward. Michael gave them one final look, then nodded slightly, needing no further arguments. Let's vote. I only ask one thing. Don't judge this proposal by next quarter's profits. Judge it by the look in your kids' eyes when you're there for the moments they need you most. The phone rang at 8:46 a.m., just as Michael was adjusting his tie in front of the mirror, preparing for a meeting with a foreign investment fund. He glanced at the screen. Emily, Michael. Her voice came fast, trembling. It's Caleb. An asthma attack. Worse than usual. I'm on my way to Massachusetts General. He didn't ask questions. The tie fell to the floor. Within 2 minutes, he was in his car, shoving aside every meeting, every report, every reminder from his assistant. His hands shook on the steering wheel, his heart hammering as if he were the one struggling to breathe. At the hospital, he burst into the ER like a man unmoored. A nurse glanced at him, rumpled business attire, panicked face, and pointed to room 314. Caleb lay in a small bed, his face pale and ashen, an oxygen mask covering half of it. Emily sat beside him, gripping his hand, her eyes still wild with fear. Michael sank into a chair, resting a hand gently on his son's arm. I'm here, buddy. The hospital room grew quiet, punctuated only by the steady rhythm of the breathing machine. Outside, the sky was gray, a fine mist of rain falling as if the world itself had slowed for a child gasping for air. Michael's gaze never left Caleb, each shallow breath twisting his gut. No Singapore, no shareholders, no pressure. Just the fragile breathing of a son he'd missed for the first 6 years of his life. Emily placed a hand on his shoulder, light as a nod of understanding. They didn't speak. They just stayed, 3 of them, in the deepest silence, waiting for life to steady itself again. The next morning, the doctor entered the room. We'll discharge him today, but he needs close monitoring. Don't leave him alone for the next few days. Michael stood tall, his spine like a rock-solid pillar after a storm. He squeezed Caleb's hand, feeling the warmth slowly returning. Caleb, he said, voice low and steady. I'll be with you. I'm not going anywhere, not for $1 million meeting, not for anyone's call. I'll choose you. Emily looked at him. For the first time, her gaze held no reservation, only respect. Michael turned to the doctor. I'll rework every schedule, But tonight, he's having dinner at home, with his mom and with me. He left the hospital with Caleb and Emily like a man emerging from a desert, parched, weary, but fully awakened, not because the company stood strong, but because he finally had learned to stand strong for someone else. Saturday, 3:47 p.m. Michael stood before the doors of Riverside School's gymnasium, his heart beating faster than usual. In a simple shirt, no tie, no laptop, he wasn't a CEO anymore. Just a father keeping his most important promise. "I'll be there. I'll watch you compete." He pushed the door open. The clack of chess pieces against boards, the murmur of voices, and rows of parents packed the stands. At table 1, Ethan sat, a 6-year-old with an uncanny focus, facing a 4th grader from a prestigious private school. Ethan glanced up briefly, saw his dad, and smiled. Michael nodded slightly, sending a silent message. "I'm here now, and I'm not going anywhere." The match stretched on, each minute feeling endless. Ethan moved his knight with calm precision, his brows furrowing slightly. He ignored the whispers around him, hearing only his father's voice from the night before. "Don't be afraid to lose, just play your hardest, and I'll always be proud." A bold move. Ethan slid his queen to the far end, sacrificing it to bait his opponent. The room held its breath. 1 minute, 2, then checkmate. The referee raised a hand. Ethan won. He sat still for 3 seconds, then looked up, searching for his dad in the crowd. When he saw Michael clapping, a smile erupted across his face, bright, real, unguarded. The award ceremony followed. A gleaming silver trophy and a certificate were placed in his small hands. He stepped onto the podium, gazing down at the audience. "I want to thank my teacher and my friends." Ethan's voice rang through the microphone, shaky but clear. "And especially my dad, who came right on time. I thought he'd be busy, but he really came." Michael bowed his head, tears silently tracing the corners of his eyes. He wasn't striving to be the best anymore. He just needed to be there, on time, fully present, a father. As the 3 of them left the gymnasium, Ethan clutching his trophy, Ryan bouncing around as if he'd won it himself, and Caleb, though quiet, holding Michael's hand tightly. The moment felt complete. "Dad?" Ethan asked. "Can I keep the trophy in your room?" Michael squeezed his son's hand gently. "Not my room, Ethan. Now it's home, for me and all of you." The Boston sky glowed with warm gold that afternoon. In Michael's heart, a new chapter had begun. It wasn't just Ethan's victory. It was a triumph of fatherhood. An old life closed and a fuller one, whole, healed, and soaring, had just started. The spring sunlight spread gently over the Bennett Family Innovation Campus, a vision once confined to imagination, now standing vividly in reality. Modern buildings blended seamlessly with green spaces, the sound of children's laughter echoing from the playground beside glass-walled offices, a harmonious picture of work and family, success and love. Michael Bennett walked slowly along the stone-paved path, flanked by young employees dropping their kids off at the on-site preschool and mothers chatting after morning exercise. Each face he passed didn't regard him with the fear of a subordinate, but with respect. They knew this man had relinquished part of his lofty ambition to restore true value to life. Inside the library's reading room, Ethan explored the solar system with his classmates. In the backyard, Ryan coached his friends in a spirited game of ball, and Caleb, the boy who once withdrew into silence, now worked with a small group assembling a model spaceship. His eyes shone, his hands moved with agility, and every time he looked up, he sought a familiar gaze. Michael was always there, no longer late, no longer absent. That evening, in the cozy warmth of their new home, not as lavish as the old penthouse, but brimming with laughter, Emily stood by the kitchen preparing dinner with the 3 boys. Michael carried in a tray of freshly baked cookies he'd just learned to make. imperfect but fragrant. "Family," he said, "is the most important project of my life." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with trust. No more doubt, no more lingering questions. They weren't just two people who once loved each other. Now they were parents, partners, two souls rewriting a chapter of life with forgiveness and awakening. At the campus inauguration, Michael kept his speech brief. He simply said, "We can't always get it right from the start, but if we're brave enough to listen, especially to the smallest among us, we can try again, and this time get it right." In the sunset's red glow bathing the campus, the three boys ran freely, their laughter ringing out at their parents' feet. Emily slipped her arm through Michael's, and for the first time in years, they no longer felt the need to try to be a family. They were a family whole, reborn and stronger than ever. A family reborn from love, redemption, and a vision far beyond profit. A vision of a generation growing up with parents by their side, not miles away. And that was the true legacy. This story reminds us that true success isn't measured by fame, but by the moments we show up for our family. Thank you for listening with Millionaire and Heart Stories. See you again in our next inspiring journey.